for the Embryo Adoption Awareness Center. We are excited to have you all here this morning and very pleased to bring you the webinar entitled Embryo Donation and Adoption, Dispelling the Myths. Before we get started, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation using the questions you submit through the Q&A feature. You may submit your questions at any time during the session, and we will answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. To ask a question, simply click on the Q&A panel on the lower right-hand portion of the screen, type in your question into the dialog box, and click the Send button. If you happen to be in the full screen view, you can click on the question mark icon on the toolbar in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. This will open the Q&A panel on your screen only. When you submit your question, it will be visible to all of the panelists, but not visible to other attendees. We expect the presentation to last approximately 45 minutes, with 15 minutes for Q&A. We will be distributing copies of today's presentation and a list of any of the answers to questions that you asked during the webinar. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties during the presentation, please contact WebEx Technical Support at 866-229-3239. And just as a reminder, this presentation is being recorded today. Let me switch over. Our presenters today are Ms. Kimberly Tyson. Kimberly is the Marketing and Program Director for the Embryo Adoption Awareness Center and Nightlight Christian Adoptions. She works with clinics nationwide to bring awareness about embryo adoption as a unique family-building option. And then we also have Ms. Chris Probasco. Ms. Probasco has over 40 years of experience of infertility counseling and adoption experience. She is the founder and CEO of Clinical Counseling Associates and established adoption and fertility resources in 1993. We are both so happy. We're happy to have you both here this morning. And Kimberly, I know that you're getting started this morning, so you can go ahead and take it away.
All right. Thanks so much, Deb. I appreciate that. Good morning, everybody. We are so pleased to have you join us this morning to learn a little bit about some of the myths associated with embryo adoption. And we're going to lead off that presentation this morning with some donor issues, some clinic misperceptions about issues pertaining to donors. So first we're going to focus on donors with remaining embryos, and the first myth we're going to look at is that donors prefer to donate their remaining embryos to an anonymous recipient. We have found that this is a myth. And the reason we have found that this is a myth, next slide please, is that it's difficult for patients to give up control of their embryos to another party, whether that's a clinic or somebody that they've hand-selected. They're worried that they're never going to know who receives their donated embryos, if there was ever any children born as a result of these embryos. And we've actually had many of our donor families through the embryo adoption program at Snowflakes tell us about why they preferred to be able to choose the family rather than just donate their embryos anonymously. And this particular donor, Anne, said the decision would have been so much easier if I had been given some say in the process of placing my embryos with the recipient family. The unknowns that circle around, oh, what will happen if I donate my embryos? What will happen to these children? Because the real bottom line is these families have children that were born as a result of this particular batch of embryos that were created, and now the embryos, they have taken on new respect for those embryos with the family, and they really do a lot of times want to know what has occurred with them that they haven't previously been able to get that information when they donate anonymously through a clinic. So that's definitely a myth. All right, next slide. Now we have 4 items on here that what are embryo adoption programs really alike? And all 4 of these are myths, and embryo adoption is just as expensive as IVF. Embryo adoption agencies require open adoptions. Agencies won't accept embryos that were created with donor egg or sperm, and nobody is donating their embryos. All 4 of these items are myths. The cost of embryo adoption is roughly I should back up. The total cost of an embryo adoption, including all of the items, both fixed and variable costs that the client will incur, is roughly $13,000 to $15,000. Depends on the variable cost of the frozen embryo transfer or the home study that the client has to have completed for the adoption process. So on average, I would say most IVF programs are running about $15,000. Sometimes less. Clinics are getting pretty creative in the pricing schemes that they're offering to their clients for IVF. But if a client has to use donor eggs for their IVF treatment, the cost is exponentially higher than $15,000. Embryo adoption agencies do not require open adoptions, but they are going to be counseling the patient that we believe that open adoption is the best process to apply, and it's in the best interest of them, the donor, of the adopting family, but most importantly, in the best interest of the child. Agencies will accept embryos that were created with donor egg and sperm. In fact, most of the embryos that are donated, about 50% of them, are created with donor egg and sperm. So this is definitely a myth. And lots of people are still donating their embryos. There are over 600,000 embryos in frozen storage in the United States. Certainly not all of those are available for donation for reproduction. The majority of them are being held for the future use of the people that created them. But there is about 6 to 8% of the population with remaining embryos out there that would love to donate their embryos for reproduction, and many of them are interested in choosing the family. That's not the right choice for everybody, but there is a significant portion of people that would prefer to choose the family for the remaining embryos. Next slide, please. Often we find that clinics with embryo donation programs have a waiting list for people who are interested in using donated embryos. So the assumption is that agencies must have waiting lists as well. This is false. This is a myth. We actually were talking with a fertility counselor not too long ago, and she says, "You mean you guys have embryos available that my patients could receive now?" And the answer to that question is yes. Particularly with the Snowflakes program, we have had over 1,000 families donate their embryos through the program. We always have embryos waiting for a match with a family. And we have people calling us every day interested in donating their embryos and being able to choose the family for those remaining embryos. Next slide, please. There's a lot of misperceptions about why I can't donate my embryos, and some of those are I only have one embryo frozen left. I have children that were born from these embryos that have a genetically inherited illness already manifested in this living child. I already have tested positive for a particular infectious disease. What we've been dealing with lately as far as infectious disease is concerned is the virus CMV, which I'm not even going to try and pronounce that, but CMV is its acronym. And the majority of the human population carries this virus, but there are a handful of people that test negative for this virus. This is an important aspect for people to know about when we are talking about embryo donation and the recipients of those embryos, because there are a lot of clinics out there that will not transfer CMV positive embryos into a CMV negative patient. So, but as we're talking in this presentation, people have the misperception that, oh, I can't donate because I have an infectious disease. These are all myths. The Snowflakes Embryo Adoption Program, and I know also the National Embryo Donation Center in Knoxville, Tennessee, will accept any and all embryo donations, regardless of these issues right here and many other issues that people think will preclude them from being a valuable donor. The Snowflakes program will allow people with only one remaining frozen embryo to donate them. If they already have children who have an inherited genetic illness, we will still accept those embryos, and we will accept those embryos if the patient has, the donor patient has tested positive for an infectious disease. Next slide, please. And Chris, am I handing this over to you? I am.
You are doing that.
Chris,
Shirley.
next
All right.
section is you.
All right. Great job, girl. Good morning to everybody, and I want to thank you for being part of this webinar this morning. It's always an exciting event for me to be presenting. You know, I love to talk, so this is a good opportunity. So we're going to talk about donor issues with donor misperceptions. So next slide, please. I'll always feel like the child was meant to be in our family. I don't really hear that very much from prospective donors, so that definitely is a myth. What I hear is I was meant to parent the children we gave birth to, and the remaining frozen embryos were meant to have parents, and therefore we're choosing embryo adoption so that our quest for those embryos can be fulfilled. So I really don't see that at all. I'll never know what happens to my embryos, and that is a myth because you certainly can know what happens to your embryos. You can have communication with the intended parents. You know about the pregnancy, the birth, and I've had families exchange gifts and send presents and really celebrate that their embryos were able to come to life and that their family they chose are now parents. So I think the not knowing is really what creates more tension and frustration, and the knowing provides a sense of completion and joy. It's impossible for us to come to a decision. I see that often, but I think that also is a myth because couples will come together once they maybe receive counseling or they seek advice from their minister or family, that making a decision that these are embryos that we have given life to and we want to be able to continue that life. If they have that for the basis of their agreement, then all the details on top of that will just fall into place. Next slide, please. And I think we were going to have Miss Kim do this one.
That's right.
All righty, girl.
The perils of Google.
Right.
We all know that we like to self-diagnose, and the same thing happens in embryo adoption. There's a lot of information out there on the Internet, but thankfully some of the top search results are for websites that we have had a part in creating. So next slide, please. So this one always kind of makes me chuckle, probably Chris too. I know, we can't donate our embryos because the recipient family can claim child support from us for those embryos. And the fact of the matter is that embryos are considered property in the United States and not people, so there's no way that the donor family is going to have to be responsible for child support. In fact, in the legal contracts that are signed between the donor and the recipient family, the donor is relinquishing all of the parental rights and responsibilities to any child that is born as a result of their donation. So this is a myth. Next slide, please. If the adopting family dies, the child gets sent to foster care. Honestly, sometimes when I hear some of these things, I'm like, really? Gosh, that just never even crossed my mind. But obviously it has crossed somebody's mind, and we want to identify that as a myth. Again, as in the last slide, the donor family is relinquishing all of their parental rights and responsibilities. And so the adopting family, if something happened to those parents and they were not able to parent anymore, part of being a responsible parent is identifying guardians for your children. And they would be doing the same thing for any children that they gave birth to as a result of the embryo donation. The other thing we need to keep in mind is that in the United States, each state in the United States identifies the mother on the birth certificate as the mother who gave birth to the child, and the man to whom she is married is legally the father of that child. So legally, at the birth of the child, the embryo adopting parents are identified as the legal parents of the child, and therefore they're going to have all of the responsibilities associated with being a parent. Now, what I could see happening is that we do have donor and adopting families that become very close with one another, and I could see, I've never heard of this happening, but I could see that if they were close enough to one another and decided to make one another the guardians of their children, that could possibly happen. But sending the children off to foster care would be a result of negligence on the adopting family's part, the reason we have our families go through the home study process is because we're trying to make sure that they are going to be responsible and loving parents to any children that the donor places with them. Next slide, please. Chris, I think this is you.
And here comes me. All righty. So we're talking about the myths around a designated placement, and also the open relationship that's created between the two families. Next slide, please. So it's hard to bond with the baby that you're not genetically yours. I think the adoption process has really already seen this as a myth. We connect to our children in a variety of ways, and with an embryo adoption and carrying the child for 9 months, this actually creates even a more secure bond. Next slide. So, again, it's hard to bond with the child not genetically yours. I think the attachment and bonding process is always a process. And I think the first step in attaching to this child is really attaching to the knowledge of their genetic family, that they accept this family, they understand this family, they'll be supportive of that family in the future, and they forevermore will be connected to that family because of sharing genetic children in parenting. So I think that's the first step in the process. The physiological process also encourages the bonding because the parents are providing prenatal care. The woman is carrying the child, experiences all that is involved in a pregnancy, and then the husband is there going to appointments, is there when the child is born. So all of that is an accepting process of attachment and bonding. There's also social reinforcement. How many times that I've been pregnant 3 times in my life, and I loved when doors were being opened for me. I loved when I could park in the special parking spot for pregnant people. You know, these are all positive reinforcements that you are going to be a parent of this child, and societal recognition of that. And the child will attach as children attach. They don't know that this is a different uterus than what they were intended to be placed. They do their job of attaching and bonding and being within the mother's body, and also attaching to the environment and sounds and music and such around them. So this completely is a myth, and I think the adoption world has proven this, as well as the embryo adoption world. Okay, next slide, please. So open adoptions, I get this so much. I was talking with a colleague a while back, and I've been doing this for over 40 years, as you all have heard before, but I brought open adoption to Kansas City. I was blessed with mentors that was part of the early open adoption movement. And open adoption means that the child doesn't lose their genetic family, their birth family. There's always a way to have a connection. And honor, when you accept a child by adoption or by embryo adoption, You are accepting their genetic family as part of who they are, part of who they're going to become. So for most people, they go really to the place of, well, yes, I would want them to know how the baby is doing, how the child is doing, and send pictures so we can all celebrate their life and all the activities that's involved with that. So open adoption means you have a connection. You have a way to connect to each other. With snowflakes, they do a wonderful job. If families do not want identified connection, that they connect through the agency. And I know at Christmas time they get lots and lots of presents to pass on, and it's just a wonderful availability for the child. And you never know when you're going to need that family for medical reasons, perhaps social information, and emotional information. So having a lifeline to each other just keeps everything above board and open and honest. Next slide, please. That is a myth, yes, okay. We'll never know what happens to the child. Oh, boy, that's hard. That's hard to even think about, that we gave life to our embryo, and now we won't be able to know what's happened to them. By choosing an open relationship and choosing to work with an agency or to work with identified couple, we create what's going to be happening in the relationship in that initial discussion. And part of the home study will help people learn that all of these are myths. So informing the child as they grow about how they came to the family, I'm not seeing the rejected feelings or that people don't care about me, that these aren't my children, because there's a full acceptance during the pregnancy and a full knowledge that the adoptive family have received through the home study to explain this to the child. So as they grow, they will know that this is this is my beginnings, and this is the family that is raising me, and these are my day-to-day parents, and you can't get any better than that. The job of the adoptive family is to tell the child everything that they need to know and for the child to understand. So obviously that's a long-term process. The goal is that we want the child to not have the negative feelings we've seen in the past with anonymous donor placements, as well as with adoption in the past when it was completely secret. We want them to be able to say, I always knew how I came to my family. I never remember being told. So obviously that's a continued process. And I think we have me going further. Okay, so what about the kids? I just can't help myself talking about the kids. I already did that in the previous, but I'll talk some more. Next slide, please. Telling our kids that they may have genetic siblings. I would like to have that telling our kids that they have genetic siblings rather than may have, because the may have means they could, where in the world are they? What do they look like? What are they doing? So the telling of the process is that the story belongs to the child, and it's the parent's responsibility to tell the story so that they are well informed about who they are. I've talked to many, many adopted people as well as people conceived by donor saying it is my business. I am genetically connected to another family. I'm in charge of my medical records, and I need to have the truth so that I can be a productive human being and making good decisions about myself. It's also about our identity of who we are, and all the pieces fit together as a child is going through their identity search and sense of self. Will they be mad? They may have some disappointments about this process. They may have questions of why I'm not being raised with my genetic family. And when those questions become more than the adoptee families can understand, then of course they have a way to connect the lifeline again to the genetic family to help understand. I think we as adults make too big of a thing about this. For kids, it just becomes their normal, and it's just who they are, and if there's not secrecy involved and anonymous involved, then they have all of their pieces to put together. Next slide, please. We don't need to tell them because we gave birth to them. Well, yes, that's true. That's one of the great opportunities of embryo adoption is the birthing and prenatal care process. But it is their business. This is who they are, their full identity. It comes from the nature-nurture. So 50% of who they are is by nature and 50% by nurture. And if they continue to struggle what they received by nature and don't have recognition and respect for that, then kids know something's wrong. I've talked to many, many donor offsprings as well as adopted people that say, I knew something was different. You know, I go to family reunions and I'm the only child with brown hair, the rest have blonde hair. You know, what in the world is going on? And their mind goes into fantasies of, did my mom have an affair? What's all going on? The truth is much more better than any kind of fantasies that the child could create. So they deserve their truth about themselves. Next slide, please. So telling our kids means that they will tell others, and then they'll share this with the whole world. You know, I think the whole world is really a big place. We can, and this actually is a myth, because we can talk to our children about privacy and secrecy and next slide, please. So in families, we just do this, we operate this way regarding secrecy and privacy. So secrets means we've done something wrong, and there is nothing wrong with receiving an embryo and giving birth to a child. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a cause of celebration. So why in the world would we want a secret around that, saying we've done something wrong? Private means that this is our private business. Not everyone will understand, and so as you're talking to your friends about life in general, of course you can talk to them about your story, but they may not understand. So we want to be your helpers. We want you to understand, and if you get responses by other people that they don't understand, you will help them with that and help them for the next time when they tell their story and they may get the same question, that they'll have the answer very, very clear for them. This is building the child's self-esteem around who they are and who they're going to become. And the parent's assistance in that is definitely one of their responsibilities. Next slide, please. And I think we have a Kim girl here.
All right. So we're going to be looking at some of the myths surrounding the embryo recipient and look at some fact and fiction around that. All right, next slide. So one of the big myths that is out there is that, all of these embryos that are remaining after IVF cycles they're not viable. They're not the best embryos. These are the leftovers. We know the word leftover in the USA lexicon is like not the best, the stuff that was left over. Well, the reality is that what happened for the family that was going through IVF, of course, their doctor is examining the embryos, and the embryologist is choosing the embryos that they believe are going to have the best chance of giving that child a family, because the clinic is in the same business we're in with embryo adoption, and that is helping the family give birth. The embryos that are remaining in storage aren't necessarily of a poorer quality. If you go to embryoadoption.org to our video section, we have a video in there by Dr. Jeffrey Nelson with HRC Fertility in Pasadena, California. He talks about embryo quality and the myths surrounding embryo quality. Babies have been born from embryos of all types, be it frozen on day 1 through day 5. They have been frozen for many, many years, some embryos. There is a child that has been born from embryos stored 20 years, another child born from embryos just last year that had been frozen for 19 years. And you can pretty much bet that the embryos that have been frozen longer were probably frozen at an earlier stage in their development than ones that are frozen currently. Most of the time, embryos in this day and age are being frozen at day 5, which is the blastocyst stage. But what we have found is that embryos are pretty resilient, and that we have had children born from many, many different types, and we hate to call them qualities of embryos, because we believe every embryo should have the opportunity to be born. Next slide, please. I think I kind of talked about this already. Right now, the norm is to transfer 5-day blastocysts into the womb. And this can still be true if you adopt embryos that were frozen on day 2. What can happen is that they will continue to thaw those embryos and continue to grow them out in the lab until they reach the blastocyst stage, and then transfer the embryos. So, but the fact that you'll only have success if you receive 5-day blastocyst embryos is a myth. The availability of embryos. Is this me or you? This is me, Chris. Okay, yeah. Thank you. So we have talked about the availability of embryos already. This person a long time ago said, I would love to do an adoption of an embryo, but where I live, I was told that there's a waiting list of years because there are so few embryos available. The number of embryos that have been donated through the Snowflakes program now well exceeds 5,000. And as I said, we receive more embryos every day. Many adoption agencies have embryos waiting. I know the National Embryo Donation Center has embryos waiting. I know Snowflakes has embryos waiting. I also know that there are many clinics who have patients waiting for embryos through their donation program. And it would be great if these clinics could educate their patients that, you know, if you are interested in working through this program, through an embryo adoption program, you might be able to be matched with embryos more quickly. Next slide, please. So that leads to the question of the rhetoric that I hear frequently in the clinic community is that agencies are placing unnecessary hurdles in front of patients who desire to use donated embryos. And I guess it's just what your worldview may be, or your perception of what is the right process to be used. But back in 1997, when the Nightlight Christian Adoption Agency established the first embryo adoption program called Snowflakes, their perception was the end result of the placement of an embryo into another family, into the recipient's womb. The hoped-for end result is the birth of a child, not a piece of furniture, not some inanimate object, but a human being. And we have established processes for the placement of human beings into families, and we call that adoption. And so it was at that time that the executive director of the program felt like the best practices of adoption should be applied to this process because it was in the best interest of the child, number one, and would be beneficial to the donor and the recipient families as well. And we have found over the almost now 20 years that we've been doing this, that applying the best practices of adoptions of adoption truly has benefited all of the parties involved. You know, you've heard us speaking today about openness and the value of openness to all of the parties involved, but particularly the child. What you will find in America today is that adoption agencies are very child-centric and wanting to make sure that we are placing children into families that are loving and nurturing and kind to give confidence to that donor family. You know, we're reviewing that recipient family through the home study process because we're trying to instill confidence in the donor that the family they're placing with is a family that they would want to see a child raised in. So this is a myth. Moving right along to the next slide there. Okay, so there's also some myths around who agencies will work with. Okay, I'm trying to figure out how to word this in my head. Stay-at-home moms. Some people who are donating want to have stay-at-home moms. We would accept people that want to be stay-at-home moms. So if you're adopting and you want to be a stay-at-home mom, that's fantastic. You just have to demonstrate they have the financial wherewithal to do that. Agencies won't work with people who aren't religious. Agencies won't work with people who aren't married. Agencies won't work with people who need to use a surrogate. Agencies won't work with people who are in the LGBT community, and all of these things are myths. So the fact is that most agencies are very open to working with people of all walks of life. They have things within their program that guide them in the placement of embryos into families, but I do know that the Snowflakes program in particular is willing to work with people in all of these categories. The fact is that our program is driven by the desires of the donor family, and it's the donor family who has the final say into which family their embryos are placed. And the Snowflakes program has worked with people in all of these categories that you see within these concentric circles. So these are myths. Next slide, please. Chris, I think you're going to talk about home studies.
I am going to talk about home studies. I've been doing home studies for over 40 years, so it's just kind of part of my body. But, you know, the home study is, I hear this a lot, waste of time, money, and I also hear from clinics of why do we have to put these poor people through a home study when they've been working so hard to have their genetic child. And that's the exact point. They have worked very hard to have a genetic child, maybe years. So the opportunity to have an alternative is a different choice. It's a different child, a different process. And the home study, next slide please, the home study really helps to recognize the differences. It was very important in the adoption era that the differences were obvious, and at one time we said that they weren't, and we didn't do well by our families. So we need to educate our families for this particular type of adoption, and education about you know, talking to the kids, talking to your families, working with your gynecologist, figuring all of this out so that they're not adopting through fear, they're adopting through peace of mind because they have all of their what-ifs and all of the things that they have struggled with in trying to have a child, and the fear of it not working, the fear that people will not approve us, you know, all of that melts away when we have the educational opportunity for the intended parents. And also we owe the donor parents a peace of mind that these families have been evaluated, that they're not criminals, they're not on the child abuse registry. They have references of people that say that they're going to be great parents. They have the financial means to be able to do this process as well as raise a child. They have figured all of that out. And so the donor family knows when they're letting go of their embryos to a particular family that they can trust that that family is prepared and ready for their particular situation. Who will, when we're prepared, then we will be able to accept the child that comes into their family. Next slide. Back one, please. There we go. I've mentioned the education, and the reality is that, yes, the home study is fact-finding. We have a lot of facts that we need to obtain, and then it's really a educational process, probably 80% education and 20% fact-finding, and we can really secure that these families are prepared for the experience that they're going to go forward with. So I think it's very helpful for everyone, and in particularly the child. They need to be born into a family that really has grieved the loss of their own genetic child and have moved on to accepting that the way for us to become parents is to choose embryo adoption and hopefully have a successful transfer and the birth of a child. And that child is different than the child they had anticipated many years ago of conceiving. So you're really honoring and respecting the child, that we have additional parenting responsibilities because how this child arrived to us. And not good or bad, it's just our responsibilities, and we take that very seriously. And I think the home study really helps in that approach, in that preparation. Next slide, please. So it's too risky. Many people won't get selected. It takes too long to get selected in an adoption process. And, I think Kimberly would have many, many stories of a family applying for snowflakes, and the next day they have a prospective donor that's interested in them. So it can be that quick, or it could be several months before they are selected. So these definitely are myths. In doing this work for so long, I have not met a family that is an approved home study family that has not been able to adopt. I just don't know how and when the process will be completed for them, but this is where their faith comes into being very important, that we will become parents. This is the direction we chose, and we're going to be available and be part of the process until we have the opportunities of a transfer of an embryo and hopefully the birth of an embryo. So all of those are myths out there, and I think it really puts more of a damper on looking at adoption programs because of all the things, oh, this will happen or that will happen. And, really the myth is a part of the what if in grieving. So we have this idea in our head, and we put it where we're grieving, and it's hard to figure that out. So if this myth is true, that I don't want to be part of this process, without really investigating, asking the right questions to make sure that the myths melt away, and then you also progress in your grieving process. So confronting the myths is very, very helpful, and I'm so excited there's so many people listening today so they can understand the reality of what we're discussing in terms of embryo adoption. Next slide. Yes, we all will be part of the celebration of children coming to families. one of the jobs I have in my practice is that we do a legal adoption, and I get to have visits in the home after birth to visit with the family and the children to see how they're doing and report back to court. And I just can't resist myself of just kissing all over this baby and say, you don't feel cold at all. You've been all warmed up, and just see the rejoice on the family's faces. We talk about the donor family, talk about their feelings of the process, their excitement, their celebration. We're finally a family. So that's the end goal, is to have a child born to a family. We have the desire, and then we have the goal, but there's so much in between in getting us prepared for this process so we can be the best possible parents for this child, and the child will rejoice in how they came to their family.
That's right. Thank you, Chris.
You're
and
welcome.
Deb, I'm going to let you wrap up, but I just wanted to also just add that, part of the purpose of this webinar is to identify some of the falsehoods that are running around out there about embryo adoption. And embryo adoption is not the solution for everyone. Embryo donation through a clinic may be the best choice for a family, but we do believe that families should have the knowledge of what the options are that are available to them so that they can choose what they believe would be best for them. And embryo donation and adoption creates families. With that, Deb, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
All right. Thank you, Kimberly. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions. If anything popped into your head while you were listening to the presentation, you can go ahead and enter it in. We have the instructions right here. And while we are waiting for you to enter your questions in, I'm going to go ahead and let you know about some future events that we have coming up. Next week, actually, I know that we just talked about open relationships and just having that option available for the children that come from embryo adoption. And so a lot of families, when they're looking into the possibility for an open adoption and for some kind of relationship with the donor family, that can be a little bit concerning. They just don't know what it looks like. And so we actually got together 3 different families that are going to share their stories about coming into embryo adoption, and then in the future, after they had children, connecting with the donor family. So we actually have one family that they donated their embryos, and then 2 families that adopted embryos, and we'll just be reviewing what that looks like for them and what their story was. And then on Wednesday, June 24th, we have embryo donation and adoption open mic night. This is just a great opportunity for anybody that has questions about donating their embryos, about adopting embryos. They can just come join. We're going to have a brief little intro to what embryo donation and adoption is about, and then it's just kind of a free-for-all. Whoever has questions, they can just jump in and get answers to those questions. So I hope that you're able to join us for either one of those webinars. They're going to be really great. And let me see if there's any questions that came in. I'm not seeing any so far. Kimberly, are you seeing any?
Well, I do see one. It says, how long does the process of embryo adoption take within certain states? And it really is not state dependent. The programs that both Chris operates and the Snowflakes program, they work not state specific. So the Snowflakes program actually works all over the world. The length of time that it takes is dependent on how quickly you get your home study done, and that sometimes can be done in as little as 2 months. And then depending on the particular aspects the recipient family has as far as, I want these kinds of things in a match with the family, what their preferences are. If they're really very picky about what their preferences are, the pickier they are, the more length of time is going to be added to the process of matching them with the donor family. But generally speaking, people move through to having possession of the embryos and being ready to do their frozen embryo transfer with their doctor within about 6 months of entering the program on average. Some people get matched quicker, some take a little longer.
So I'm seeing another question. Does being a gun owner mean you will fail your home study? So this definitely is one of the questions, and we work with families that have a variety of, pets, and they are hunters. So as long as they can show me a cabinet where they keep their guns that is locked, and that a child would not be able to access that cabinet, then it's way okay. So I do document that in the home study, that they are hunters and they have guns in their house for that purpose, and those guns are locked and protected from any child in their home.
I didn't know that. That's good to know.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions coming in, so I'm going to go.
Okay, well, I see one other one. It says, how common is it for an adopting family to have to go through more than one embryo adoption to have a successful pregnancy? Now, this, it looks like a simple question on the surface. It's a little more complex. And Chris, I'm going to answer, and then maybe you want to chime in a little bit more. When we are matching the donor family to the recipient family, we're obviously exploring the desires of the recipient family for children. And if the recipient family is like, we really only want to have one child, and we can only afford to do one frozen embryo transfer, then we're not going to match that family with a donor who has 13 embryos. We're going to match that recipient with a donor family who has maybe 3 or 4 embryos. So there is a success rate associated with buying embryos. On average, that's a little over 50%. Generally speaking, it's a little bit, nobody's done any research on that lately, but if you just go on average, 50% thaw success rate. So when the embryos are thawed, if you thaw 4 embryos, perhaps 2 will survive the thawing process. And then when you transfer those embryos into your womb, each of the embryos on average has a 35% chance of implanting into the uterine lining and developing into a baby. And so most people will have success within 3 transfers, but many of our families have success on the first transfer. Not all of them, but many of them. And so I'm hoping that is answering this question. So if anybody else wants to chime in and answer that, I'm open to chiming.
I think what the reproductive endocrinologists say in Kansas City, that if you've had 3, you count on 3 transfers, that those 3 transfers give you your best chance for an outcome of pregnancy and a live birth. If you're not pregnant after 3 healthy embryo transfers, then there may be other issues going on that with the uterus that needs to be explored.
Mm-hmm.
And I have lots of families that get pregnant on the first try, and then they have embryos waiting, and then a year or so later, they then start the process to having their remaining embryos transferred. So it's a process of trying to complete a family, I think, is another good way of saying it. Now, I do see another question. A military family that moves often, would they, after being matched, and then they move to another state? So what would happen is there would be an update to the home study, because they have a new location and new possible resources, and perhaps a different job. And so how has this move affected the family, and then does their home remain safe for children to come into the home? Now, if their particular state that they move to requires anything else than that, then that will be part of the update to the home study. But we're not starting all over again because you haven't changed your parents and the reasons that you want to adopt. So those are still clear, but we would update the new, what's ever new in your family.
All right. I believe I see one more. Are there particular agencies that families should go to that deal with embryo adoption versus home studies for doing adoption, like a traditional home study as opposed to an embryo-focused one?
Okay. The home study for the embryo adoption process is generally the domestic home study for a domestic adoption, and there are many agencies throughout the country that have done home studies for families that have adopted embryos. Nightlight offers a snowflake family evaluation across the country, and we will work in all of the states and travel to where the family is to complete the home study. That's one option, but that snowflake family evaluation is only available for the Snowflakes program. It is non-transferable. So if you switch to domestic or international, you would have to do a domestic or international home study to move into one of those programs. But the Snowflake family evaluation is offered at a lower cost. So that's an option that's available to families. We also have Snowflake partner agencies. Chris is one of them, who offer home study services to people interested in doing embryo adoption. And then there is a list of home studies home study providers available on snowflakes.org by state.
So I just want to add on to this. I see several families that have a domestic home study, and now they wish to move forward with an embryo adoption. So what I do is basically update their home study in terms of making this decision and choice and the type of genetic family they wish to connect to, different factors for that, and then that goes on top of their domestic home study for a complete package.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, I'm not seeing any more. Are you seeing any more?
No, I'm not.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today, and thank you, Chris and Kimberly, for presenting this webinar today, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.
Yes, we hope to see you at a future webinar.